Hi, my name's Nick Birmingham and welcome to part 4, the final part of my series on how I made my Yew Longbow. At this point I have a piece of wood that looks for all intents and purposes like a bow, but it's not yet a bow until I teach it how to bend. And to do that I'm going to use a process known as tillering. However, before I can do that I need to add horn nocks onto the end of each of the bow's limbs. These will act as attachment points for the string, whilst also serving to protect the relatively soft yew wood. For these I used water buffalo horn simply because it's readily available from most traditional archery suppliers. However, in the Middle Ages they would most likely have used either domestic cow horn or deer antler. Once the horn had been cut into 2 roughly equal sized pieces, the next task was to hollow out the horn so that it would easily fit over the ends of the bow. For this I used a 1/2 inch flat drill bit which had been ground down to an angle of about 11 degrees. I then used the same drill bit to mark out the ends of the limbs to achieve a matching taper that would provide a tight fit without any gaps or air pockets. The more surface area of the bow that comes into contact with the horn, the stronger that bond will be, and the last thing I wanted was a knock shearing off while at full draw. Once I was happy with the fit, I used a 2-part epoxy resin to attach the nocks, securing them in place during the drying process with tape. I then left them for at least 12 hours for the glue to cure, though if you have the time, it's probably best to leave them a little bit longer than this, perhaps 24 or even 48 hours. The following day I removed the tape, cut off the majority of the excess with the bandsaw, and then roughly shaped each knock with sander and rasp. It's probably worth pointing out at this point that horn absolutely stinks when it is cut and ground, so always use a dust mask and either work outside or ventilate your workshop as much as possible. Once the knock had been given its rough shape, I then cut a single groove into both nocks to hold the string in place, and a second groove on the upper knock so that I could use a stringer. I found the best way to cut these grooves was by using abrasive cord, as it gives a rounded cut and allows you to apply more friction than a file, which makes the cutting process a lot easier and quicker. This is how the upper knock looked at this point. It's not very pretty, I'll admit, but at this stage it doesn't have to be. It just needs to be functional, and I sanded and polished it to a more pleasing shape once the bow was fully finished. With the horn nocks attached, it was now time to tiller the bow. So what is tillering? Well, tillering is the process where you teach the wood to bend. It is at this point that the stave finally becomes a fully functioning bow, as opposed to a piece of wood that looks like a bow. It is the repeated bending of that stave to ever greater amounts, checking the profile of that bend to ensure the limbs are bending to a prescribed curve, removing wood where the limb appears too stiff, i.e. where it's not bending enough, and leaving wood in place where the limb appears too weak, i.e. where it's bending too much. It is also at this point that you achieve the bow's desired draw weight by progressively removing wood until you get down to a poundage that you think you can handle. Now, tillering is by far the hardest part of making a bow, and it is where the art of the bowyer really comes to the fore. Now, as I said before, I am not an experienced bowyer, so my description of this process is naturally going to be brief. And if you want more detail, then I would recommend you seek out some of the videos made by professional bowyers on YouTube, or buy one of their books, or even go on one of their courses. And I will provide some links to these in the video description below. To tiller the bow, I needed a tiller, sometimes referred to as a tillering stick or tree. These can be freestanding, though most bowyers prefer to fix them to a wall. A tillering stick is nothing more than a bracket to hold the bow, with a series of measurements to gauge the length of draw, typically extending to a maximum of 30 or 32 inches. In their most basic form, the string is drawn down by hand, with notches placed in the wood to hold the string at various lengths of draw, so the bowyer can stand back far enough to observe the bend of the limbs. In their more elaborate form, the string is drawn by means of a hand-operated winch, attached to the bowstring by means of a hook and rope. The winch makes the repeated drawing action much easier on the bowyer, especially when making bows with high poundage draw weights. This setup also incorporates a scale, so the draw weight can be measured at each stage of the draw. In both forms, it is useful to have a backboard attached to the wall behind the tiller, marked with horizontal lines to highlight the symmetry of the limbs during the draw. A substitute string is then attached to the bow for use during the tillering process. This is typically just a piece of rope, cord, or even an old bowstring that is a little longer than the final string, as this will place less stress on the bow during the initial stages of tillering. The string is also sacrificial in case the bow should break during tillering, and so the bowyer doesn't have to worry about damaging the string while they're working on the bow. So let's look at the main points of tillering. The bow is initially drawn up only a few inches to give the bowyer their first look at how the limbs are bending. The bowyer is looking for the same amount of bend from each limb, though in the case of south bows, this will be influenced by the wood's natural shape and the distribution of sapwood and heartwood on either limb. The bowyer will then slowly increase the draw in small increments of only a few inches at a time, at each stage comparing the limbs to ensure they are bending evenly. At each increase, they will exercise the bow, sometimes up to 40 or 50 times, in the process compressing the wood fibres on the belly of the bow and stretching the fibres on the back. If the limbs include knots, then these can produce areas of stiffness that take more time to get moving. It is likely that at some point the bowyer will notice the bow is no longer symmetrical, with one limb bending more than the other. This can be due to a limb being weak, i.e. it is bending too much, and this is referred to as a hinge. In this case, the area of weakness is left alone, with wood being removed from in front of the hinge to encourage the limb to bend earlier, so evening out the curve. The imbalance can also be due to one limb being too stiff, i.e. it is not bending enough. Here, a little wood needs to be removed from the area of stiffness to get the limb moving again. The wood is always taken from the heartwood on the belly of the bow and not the sapwood on the back. Once wood is removed, the bow is exercised on the tiller again, often with numerous pulls being required to have any effect. It is important not to be tempted to remove wood too quickly, but to give the wood time to be stressed and respond to the adjustments the bowyer has made, as every piece of wood removed will have an effect. That needs to be seen before deciding whether to remove more or move on. Periodically, the bowyer will also look down the length of the bow from nock to nock to check the string lies centrally. If it doesn't, wood needs to be removed from the side of the limb furthest from the string. This weakens that side and encourages the limb to bend towards that side to bring the string back into the centre. Throughout the tillering process, it is important to concentrate on the shape of the bow first and not the draw weight. The bow needs to bend evenly first before the final bowstring is attached, and work can then begin on achieving a certain draw weight. The final sanding of the bow will remove a small amount of draw weight along with the wood. The bow will also come down slightly after being shot for a while, so most bowyers will leave the bow a few pounds heavier than required to allow for this. I made this bow in the spring of 2014. It is now May of 2021. The bow is still in one piece, and in those intervening 7 years I have shot thousands of arrows off it. So if the purpose was to make a functioning bow, then my first self bow build was a resounding success. But did I make a good bow? It is certainly a durable bow with no real stress marks or cracks, either in the belly of the bow or around any of the knots in the sapwood. It has been shot in sub-zero temperatures and scorching summers, and I have let countless members of the public draw it up at living history events with no fear of it failing. However, it does have two flaws. The first is that the bow doesn't have a very good cast, i.e. it's not a fast, high performance bow, and it struggles to shoot a 3/8 inch shafted arrow more than 180 yards, and that is purely down to the fact that the limbs are too thick. Had I spent more time refining them, making them thinner, lighter, whippier, then the bow would perform a lot better. The second flaw is that the bow has twisted over time, which has resulted in the string no longer lying centrally along the bow. This doesn't affect its performance, but it does mean the bowstring slaps my forearm on the loose, and this was caused by my leaving too much wood on one side of the upper limb compared to the other. Here you can see that one side of the limb is rounded, while the other is much flatter. Other than that, it is a great bow. It looks the part, it draws up easily to just over 110 pounds at about 31 inch draw, and it still gives me a great deal of pleasure to shoot. So my 4-part video series now draws to a close. Thank you to everybody who has stuck with me over the last 7 years. I really didn't think it would take this long. I hope you found these videos interesting and useful. And for those of you who are thinking of making your own bows, I wish you the best of luck. Please do let me know how you get on.